Picture this. The echo of hammers fills the air, metal striking stone, in a rhythm of deliberate destruction. You stand in the hollow ruins of Karnak, the desert wind carrying the sting of powdered limestone and the ghosts of forgotten prayers. The air is thick, dry, and heavy with the weight of something sacred being undone. Workers, stripped to the waist under the burning Egyptian sun, swing their chisels against walls once sacred, now condemned. With every blow, they obliterate a face, a cartouche, a memory. The figure they erase is no common man, it is their Pharaoh. The year is 1334 BC. The heretic king, Akhenaten, the man who dared to defy 3,000 years of divine order, is dead. His city lies empty, his god forgotten. His name, once praised in gold and hymns, is being systematically carved away from every surface in Egypt. The priests of Amun have returned, their vengeance precise and patient. To be forgotten, this is the second death in Egyptian belief, more terrible than the first. And so, Akhenaten, once the most powerful man alive, is dying again, piece by piece, under the hammers of his own people. But the story of his erasure begins long before his name was defaced. 18 years earlier, Egypt basked in the golden age of Amenhotep III, father of the boy who would become Akhenaten. The kingdom was at the height of its power. From the cataracts of Nubia to the Euphrates in the north, gold flowed like the Nile itself. Temples shone with imported cedar and inlaid lapis lazuli. Foreign princes sent tribute, and the gods seemed satisfied. In the capital of Thebes, Amenhotep III reigned as a living sun, a man whose image was worshipped as divine. When he died after nearly 4 decades on the throne, his teenage son inherited a world at peace and a dynasty wrapped in ritual. The young prince, Amenhotep IV, should have ruled as every pharaoh before him, honoring Amun-Ra, the supreme god, and maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic balance that kept the Nile rising and the world in harmony. But within this boy, something restless burned. Perhaps it was the hours he spent alone at dawn, watching the sun rise over the river, the world bathed in a warmth that felt alive. Perhaps it was whispers in the temple schools, where the hymns to a lesser solar deity, Aten, the visible disk of the sun, spoke of a single, pure light that gave life to all. Or perhaps it was something deeper, a revelation whispered not by priests, but by the light itself, a conviction that the gods of Egypt were not many, but one. At Thebes, the heart of Egypt's religion, everything revolved around the temple of Amun at Karnak, a labyrinth of courtyards and colossal pylons that towered like mountains of stone. Thousands labored there, from priests and scribes to craftsmen and dancers. The temple was not just a place of worship, it was an empire within an empire. The high priest of Amun commanded immense wealth and political power, rivaling even the pharaoh. The estates of Amun controlled 1/3 of Egypt's farmland, owning more slaves than the royal palace itself. To challenge the god was to challenge the machinery of Egypt itself. And yet, into this glittering, suffocating world stepped Amenhotep IV, a tall, slender youth with narrow shoulders, a long neck, and features so androgynous that later generations would wonder if he was even human. Artists of his time would soon depict him with a strange, elongated skull and feminine curves, an image that seemed to blur the boundary between mortal and divine. But before the statues, before the revolution, there was only a prince who did not quite belong. His education followed the traditions of the royal house. He learned hieroglyphs and mathematics, studied astronomy, practiced military drills, and read the ancient hymns of the gods. Yet amid this rigid structure, something stirred. It might have been the words of a forgotten hymn. You rise in beauty upon the horizon, living Aten, creator of life. Or perhaps it was the endless procession of priests offering to gods who never answered. For a boy destined to rule eternity, silence from heaven can be deafening. By the time Amenhotep IV ascended the throne in 1353 BC, he had already begun to see the world differently. To him, Amun's temples, dark, secret, and filled with smoke, seemed like prisons for truth. The rituals felt like theatre, their power empty, their gods multiplied beyond reason. Egypt's pantheon had become an ocean of contradictions, but the sun, that brilliant, tangible disk, needed no translation, no priest, no ritual. Its warmth touched every man and beast alike. That was a god he could believe in. In those early years, Thebes glittered brighter than ever. Golden barges drifted along the Nile. Courtiers bowed beneath walls painted with divine scenes of eternity. Yet, beneath the surface, a quiet revolution was taking root. Amenhotep IV ordered the construction of small shrines not for Amun, but for Aten. The priests of Thebes watched uneasily as the young pharaoh elevated this obscure aspect of the sun god above all others. But the change was not proclaimed through royal decrees, it appeared first in art. The stiff, ageless poses of Egyptian sculpture faces eternal. Smiles frozen began to soften. Reliefs showed the royal family laughing, touching, living beneath the outstretched rays of Aten, each beam ending in a delicate hand offering the Ankh, the breath of life. This was more than artistic rebellion. It was spiritual defiance. For the first time, Egypt's art dared to be human. At the center of this transformation stood a woman, his queen, Nefertiti. Her name meant, "The beautiful one has come," and she embodied the new order's radiance. Unlike queens before her, Nefertiti was not a shadow behind the throne but a partner, an equal, often depicted beside Akhenaten in acts of worship. Their bond, rare in royal marriages arranged for politics, seemed genuine. Together they stood beneath the blazing sun, their daughters reaching toward them, their faces alive with joy. It was a vision of divine family, made flesh, husband, wife, children, and God, united beneath one light. As the sun set over Thebes, its rays pouring over the gilded obelisks of Amun, the old world still believed itself eternal. The priests carried on their chants, the people offered their prayers, and the statues of the gods looked down, unmoving. Yet something had already shifted. A young king was listening not to the priests, but to the silence between their hymns, and in that silence he heard the voice of the sun. Soon, his vision would consume Egypt itself. The transformation began quietly, like the whisper of wind before a storm. At first, the court of Thebes dismissed the young pharaoh's devotion to Aten as a passing eccentricity, another of youth's divine experiments. But by the 4th year of his reign, the winds of change were stirring across Egypt, and the first cracks were forming in the foundations of its ancient faith. Thebes, the city of 100 gates, shimmered in the desert sun. Its temples rose like mountains, and the god Amun ruled from within their shadows. Gold glittered across walls carved with scenes of endless conquest. Priests in white linen walked corridors perfumed with incense, their chants echoing through stone halls. They believed their god eternal, their rituals immutable. But in the shadow of Karnak, something new was being built, a temple to Aten. Small at first, almost modest, yet daring beyond measure. For it stood beside Amun's vast sanctuary, like a spark beside a bonfire. Aten, the radiant disk of the sun, was not a new god, but never before had he been worshipped as the god. In Akhenaten's vision, Aten was no longer a symbol of Ra, no longer one among many, but the singular essence of creation itself, the light from which all life flowed. And this revelation was not confined to theology. It reshaped art, politics, and the very soul of Egypt. In the carvings of early Aten temples, the change was unmistakable. The traditional stiffness that had defined Egyptian art for millennia dissolved. Instead of timeless perfection, there was motion, tenderness, imperfection. The royal family appeared not as distant icons but as living beings. Akhenaten and Nefertiti smiling beneath Aten's rays, their daughters reaching for their parents as children, not divine props. Even the god's image changed, no longer a man or beast, but a glowing orb whose rays ended in human hands, each offering the symbol of life. It was an art of intimacy, of human emotion, a visual revolution that mirrored a spiritual one. For the first time, the divine was not hidden in darkness, but revealed in light. To his supporters, Akhenaten was a prophet. To his enemies, a madman. The priests of Amun saw their power slipping through their fingers. Their estates, rich with wheat, cattle, and slaves, funded their temples and filled their coffers. For centuries, they had mediated between gods and men, controlling access to the afterlife itself. But Akhenaten preached a dangerous message, that no priest was needed, that the sun's warmth touched all equally. It was both heresy and liberation. The tension simmered beneath the marble calm of the court. In the audience halls, the priests whispered warnings of chaos, that the king's blasphemy would anger the gods and curse the land. In private, Akhenaten grew more resolute, He had seen the truth, and truth demanded sacrifice. In his 5th year as ruler, the pharaoh cast aside the name Amenhotep. Amun is satisfied. The old god's name was now forbidden to pass his lips. From that moment, he called himself Akhenaten, effective for the Aten. His queen became Nefertiti. Beautiful are the beauties of the Aten. Together, they proclaimed a new order, a world ruled not by hidden deities and secret rites, but by light, visible to all. It was a declaration of war. As word spread, the shock reverberated across the empire. In Memphis, scribes whispered the name in disbelief. In Thebes, the priests of Amun trembled with rage. Their god's name, once spoken in every prayer, was being erased from inscriptions. Temples that had stood for centuries were suddenly defiled by omission. The god-king had turned against the gods, but Akhenaten was not content to reform. He meant to rebuild. In his 6th year, he announced a decision that stunned Egypt. He would abandon Thebes altogether. The city that had been the beating heart of the empire, the home of his ancestors' tombs, the center of the known world, he would leave it behind. He would build a new city. A city not for men or priests, but for Aten alone. Far north, between Memphis and Thebes, lay a barren stretch of desert, untouched by temple or tomb. When Akhenaten stood there for the first time, the cliffs formed a natural amphitheater, and as the sun rose, it seemed to emerge directly from the stone. To the pharaoh, it was a divine sign. Here, he declared, was the horizon of Aten Akhetaten, a city built on light. What followed was one of the most ambitious construction projects in ancient history. Tens of thousands of workers, craftsmen, quarrymen, laborers descended upon the site. They cut limestone from the cliffs and ferried it by river, the sound of chisels and hammers echoing across the valley. The blocks they used, small and uniform, called talatat, allowed them to build at astonishing speed. Within 2 years, a metropolis had risen, where once there had been only sand. The city stretched for miles along the Nile, its heart dominated by the great temple of Aten, an open sanctuary without roofs or inner chambers. The sun itself was the only ceiling, and every courtyard, every altar, stood exposed to its gaze. There were no hidden rites, no shadows. The god was not confined within walls, for Aten needed no image other than the sun that rose each morning. At dawn, the royal family would appear before their people. The first light would strike Akhenaten and Nefertiti as they lifted their arms to the heavens, the rays of Aten stretching down to touch their faces. Priests chanted hymns of creation. You rise in beauty on the horizon of the sky, O living Aten, source of all life. And as the city glowed in gold, Egypt's first and perhaps only experiment in pure monotheism began. But not everyone rejoiced. To the traditionalists, this city was madness, made stone a betrayal of the gods who had guarded Egypt since time began. Yet to Akhenaten, it was salvation, a world remade in truth and light, a city born not from politics, but from revelation. And so, in the desert heart of Egypt, under a sun that burned too bright to look upon, the Pharaoh of light declared war on darkness. At the edge of the desert, where the cliffs curve like the arc of a rising sun, a new world was born. The city of Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, rose out of the sand with miraculous speed. To those who witnessed it, it must have seemed as if the god himself had commanded it into existence. By the 9th year of Akhenaten's reign, the king and his entire court had left Thebes behind. The old temples, heavy with incense and shadow, were abandoned for open courtyards, where the sunlight fell pure and unbroken. Imagine approaching the city from the Nile, the gleam of white limestone blinding in the morning light, banners fluttering above gates inscribed with the radiant disk of Aten. Gardens lined the avenues, fed by irrigation channels drawn from the river. Palm trees and flowering sycamores swayed in the wind, their branches bowing as though in worship. In the heart of it all stood the great temple, a colossal complex stretching almost a kilometre, open to the sky so that not a corner escaped the sun's touch. No walls darkened the space, no ceiling blocked the divine light. Everywhere, there was motion and sound, priests chanting hymns, artisans carving in the soft glow, children running through the courtyards of a new kind of paradise. The temple was filled with hundreds of offering tables, each piled high with bread, beer, fruit, and flowers that glistened beneath the morning rays. When the sun reached its zenith, the offerings would steam and fade beneath its heat, a daily miracle of transformation. The god was fed, not by blood or smoke, but by light. The city itself was unlike anything Egypt had ever seen. Gone were the labyrinthine sanctuaries and colossal walls of Thebes. Here, the architecture was open, intimate, almost human. Palaces with broad windows looked onto courtyards filled with fountains and pools that mirrored the golden sky. The royal palace stretched for over a mile along the Nile, its walls painted in scenes of gardens and flocks of birds, its ceilings covered in stars. For the first time in Egyptian history, royal architecture felt alive, breathing in sunlight and air, as if the buildings themselves participated in worship. Akhenaten's ideology was reflected in every detail. The god was visible, not hidden behind veils. The pharaoh, though divine, walked among his people, basking in the same sun that gave life to peasants and nobles alike. And yet, for all its openness, this was still a world centered on one man's vision. The Aten's rays ended not upon all Egyptians, but upon Akhenaten and his family, the earthly vessels of divine light. In the mornings, before the first light touched the horizon, the priests of Aten would gather in the temple courtyards. They would face east, waiting in silence for the moment the sun's rim appeared above the cliffs. Then, as the light spread, the royal procession began. Akhenaten and Nefertiti, dressed in linen robes that caught the dawn, would emerge with their daughters. Trumpets sounded, drums echoed across the city, and the people bowed as the sunlight struck the pharaoh's face. The rays of Aten, carved in countless reliefs, would reach down like fingers from heaven, ending in tiny hands offering the Ankh, the symbol of life, to the king and queen. In this ritual, every sunrise became a moment of rebirth. To the people of Amarna, life revolved around the sun's journey across the sky. Morning was birth, noon was triumph, evening was death. The rhythm of the day became the rhythm of faith. The theology of Atenism was simple yet profound. The sun's light created all life, sustained it, and reclaimed it each night. No myths of gods battling serpents, no hidden mysteries, just light and life, seen by all. It was a religion that promised clarity, yet it demanded absolute devotion. Akhenaten's belief was not one of tolerance. The gods of Egypt, Isis, Osiris, Hathor, Thoth, were no longer merely rivals. They were lies. Their temples were sealed, their names struck from inscriptions. Priests who had once spoken for them found themselves exiled or reduced to silence. The vast estates of Amun were confiscated, their wealth redirected to Aten's service. And for the first time in millennia, Egypt's spiritual unity began to fracture. Yet within the royal court, there was a sense of divine purpose. The great hymn to the Aten, likely composed under Akhenaten's direction, captured the majesty of this vision. How manifold are your works! They are hidden from the face of man, O sole God, like whom there is no other. You create the earth according to your desire. You alone all men, cattle, and wild beasts. Whatever walks upon the earth, whatever flies in the sky. These lines, carved into the tombs of courtiers, reveal a theology far ahead of its time. It was not merely Egyptian. It was universal. Aten was not just the god of Egypt, but of all creation, the giver of life to every nation, every people. Scholars have long noted echoes of this hymn in the Hebrew Psalm 104, a tantalizing link between the sun worship of Akhenaten and the later birth of monotheistic faiths. Whether coincidence or influence, it shows how far the rays of Aten reached. But for all its beauty, Akhenaten's vision carried within it the seeds of its downfall. A religion centered on light could not tolerate shadow, and yet every human soul casts one. In the pursuit of divine purity, he stripped away not only the old gods, but also the comfort they gave. The ordinary Egyptian, who once prayed to Hathor for fertility, or Anubis for safe passage to the afterlife, now had only the distant sun, brilliant, impersonal, unreachable. And while the royal family thrived in the golden glow of their desert utopia, beyond its walls the empire began to crack. In the north, Egypt's vassal cities cried for military aid as foreign powers advanced. In the south, workers whispered that the gods were angry, but Akhenaten did not hear them. His eyes were fixed upon the horizon, upon the god he had made visible, upon the light that blinded him to the gathering darkness. Still, for a time, Akhetaten shone like a vision of heaven. The laughter of royal children echoed through its courtyards, and the king and queen strolled hand in hand beneath the burning sky. The city's people called it Aten, the House of the Sun, and believed they were living in an age of divine renewal. Yet even as the walls gleamed and the hymns rose, the shadow of mortality lingered. For every sun that rises must also set, and beneath the blinding brilliance of Aten's light, the seeds of tragedy were already sown. By the 12th year of Akhenaten's reign, the desert city of Akhetaten blazed with beauty. The courtyards rang with music, the walls shone with gold leaf, and the rays of Aten filled every chamber like liquid fire. Yet behind this radiant perfection, the royal family was drifting into something stranger, something holy, something forbidden. The heart of the empire was no longer the army, nor the bureaucracy, nor the temples. It was the royal family itself. They were the living embodiment of divine creation, Aten's light made flesh. Akhenaten and Nefertiti were not merely king and queen. They were father and mother of all life. Their 6 daughters, Meritaten, Meketaten, Ankhesenpaten, Neferneferuaten, Tasherit, Neferneferu, and Setapenre, were born beneath that same sun, their names carrying its glory. Beloved of Aten, she lives for the Aten. Beautiful are the beauties of the Aten. The reliefs of this period depict scenes of intimacy unseen in Egyptian art. The king kissing a daughter, Nefertiti cradling a child, laughter and affection replacing the solemn stillness of past dynasties. The royal palace seemed almost a family home, filled with warmth and devotion. But behind this new tenderness, a more unsettling story was unfolding. In the 12th year, Nefertiti vanished from the historical record. Whether she died, fell from favor, or assumed a new identity as co-regent under another name, Neferneferuaten, remains one of history's great mysteries. Her sudden disappearance left a void not only in the royal household, but in the cosmic order Akhenaten had built. For in his theology, the royal couple reflected the dual nature of Aten, male and female, giver and receiver of life. Without Nefertiti, that divine balance was broken, and so the king turned to the only beings who could restore it, his daughters. At first, the change was subtle. Meritaten, the eldest, appeared in new positions of prominence. She stood beside her father during ceremonies, her figure carved with the same poise once reserved for her mother. In some reliefs, she wears the crown of queenship. In others, she is shown alone with Akhenaten, receiving the rays of Aten directly. The shift was unmistakable. Meritaten was becoming queen. She was barely 16. In the language of theology, it was logical. The Aten was both father and mother of creation, a self-generating god. To mirror this perfection on earth, the royal family, too, must contain within itself the union of divine opposites. For Akhenaten, the marriage to his daughter was not lust but liturgy, a ritual of cosmic renewal. The divine bloodline must remain pure, unbroken, God within God, light within light. Yet to human eyes, it was a tragedy. The girl who had once played in her father's shadow was now both daughter and wife, child and queen. The walls of Akhetaten, painted in brilliant color, could not hide the silence of that transformation, the sound of a child becoming a symbol. Meritaten ruled beside her father for 3 years. In art, she appears radiant and composed, her figure always bathed in Aten's rays. Diplomats addressed her as the great royal wife. But her youth was shadowed by responsibility far beyond her years. The purpose of queenship was clear: to bear heirs. If Meritaten gave birth, no record survives of the children, though fragments of correspondence hint that she did. Around the 15th year of Akhenaten's reign, another man appeared in the royal circle, Smenkhare, a young prince of uncertain origin, perhaps a brother, son, or adopted heir. Meritaten married him, becoming queen to both father and co-regent, her dual role, embodying the contradictions of a dynasty, collapsing under its own divine weight. Meanwhile, another daughter rose to take her place beside the pharaoh Ankhesenpaten. She lives for the Aten. Barely 14, she was crowned as great royal wife. Her youthful face began to appear in temple reliefs, where Nefertiti's image once stood. Beneath the hands of Aten's rays, she smiled with the same serene devotion. But her new role was not merely ceremonial. In Akhenaten's mind, she was part of the sacred continuum, a necessary vessel for the god's eternal creation. The foreign envoys who visited Akhetaten must have watched these changes with unease. Their letters, preserved in the Amun archives, hint at confusion and quiet alarm. "The great king, my lord," wrote one ruler, is as the sun who shines over all lands. But in his house, the order of heaven has changed. None dared say more. Inside the palace, the human cost of these divine arrangements was becoming unbearable. The younger daughters, Akhetaten, Nefertiti, and the others lived under the weight of expectation. Each could one day be called to fulfill a sacred duty that defied the boundaries of nature. Reliefs carved in the royal tomb show the most heartbreaking evidence of all: the death of Akhetaten. In the mural, Akhenaten and Nefertiti stand in mourning before a couch on which lies a young woman, surrounded by attendants and midwives. A wet nurse holds a newborn infant. The implication is devastating. Akhetaten, scarcely older than her sister queen, died in childbirth, possibly carrying her father's child. For a man who claimed to worship life, Akhenaten's world had become haunted by death. Yet to him, even tragedy had divine meaning. Each loss was a return to Aten's embrace, another soul ascending with the setting sun. In the hymns sung in those final years, there is no mention of grief, only surrender. When you set in the western horizon, the land is in darkness as if in death, one verse declares. But every day you rise again, and all things live. Perhaps Akhenaten believed his family's suffering was proof of faith, that through pain they approached the god's perfection. Perhaps he was simply lost in the blinding logic of his own revelation. Whatever his reasoning, the royal household of Amarna had become both temple and tomb, a place where holiness demanded sacrifice. By now, whispers spread beyond the palace walls. The common people, deprived of their old gods, could no longer understand this new religion of light. They saw a king who worshipped the sun while famine crept across the land. They saw their Pharaoh not as the father of Egypt, but as a man consumed by his own divine image. And as the sun blazed over Akhetaten, unrelenting and pitiless, the people began to turn away. In that merciless brilliance, the Pharaoh of light was being devoured by his own creation. By the 16th year of Akhenaten's reign, the horizon of Aten, once radiant and filled with promise, was beginning to fracture. What had started as a vision of divine perfection was now a gilded cage of devotion and decay. Beneath the blinding light of Aten, shadows were gathering. The city of Akhetaten, once a living hymn to the sun, was changing. The workers' quarters that had once buzzed with laughter and song grew silent. Storehouses that had overflowed with grain stood half empty. The stone quarries echoed less often with the sound of chisels. The grand building projects had slowed. The wealth of Egypt, once infinite under Amenhotep III, was vanishing like morning dew. The letters that came to the pharaoh from foreign vassals were desperate. Carved into clay tablets and sent from the cities of Canaan and Syria, they carried the same plea: send help. From Byblos, the governor Ribhada wrote in anguish, I fall at the feet of the king, my lord, my God, my son, 7 times and 7 times. May the king send archers. If there are no archers this year, all the lands of the king will perish. Others followed. The ruler of Jerusalem begged for soldiers to repel invaders. From the north, the king of Mitanni warned that the Hittites were marching, conquering Egypt's allies one by one. But Akhenaten's replies, when they came, were vague and full of promises that never materialized. He sent hymns instead of armies, sunlight instead of soldiers. To those who begged for protection, he offered prayer. The world beyond his golden city was burning, and yet he remained blind, transfixed by the light of his God. Inside the palace, the same blindness was spreading. The art that once celebrated the warmth of family life now seemed distorted. The figures grew more elongated, the faces more strained. Statues of the pharaoh showed his body twisted, almost unnatural narrow chest, drooping belly, wide hips. Whether these forms were symbolic, representing divine duality, or reflections of an actual ailment, no one could say. But the effect was unnerving. The god-king no longer resembled a man at all. Some whispered that Aten's fire had consumed him, that the divine radiance he worshipped had begun to melt the flesh from his bones. Others believed the deformities were the result of divine bloodline purity, generations of intermarriage meant to preserve holiness, now producing sickness instead. The very strategy meant to ensure immortality had sown the seeds of ruin. And yet, to his followers, Akhenaten seemed untouchable. Each morning he stood beneath the blazing sun, offering prayers of life and renewal, his thin arms raised in devotion. He believed his God was eternal, that the empire would endure so long as Aten's light filled the world. but the people could no longer see divinity in their suffering. In the marketplace, voices grew bold. Farmers spoke of failed harvests. Merchants complained of trade routes disrupted by war. The temple of Aten, open to all, felt empty to those who longed for the personal comfort of Isis or the protection of Osiris. Aten gave no miracles, no stories, no afterlife. His religion was pure light, and light reveals but does not console. In secret, the old gods began to return. Small amulets of Amun and bears appeared again in homes, hidden under mats or sewn into clothing. Families whispered the old prayers before sleep. The people had learned that one could live under the eye of Aten, but one could not love him. Within the royal family, tragedy followed tragedy. Akhetaten was gone, her death immortalized in the carved mourning of her parents. Meritaten's marriage to Smenkhkare, part love, part politics, was brief. The young co-regent himself disappeared from the records soon after, his death as sudden and mysterious as Nefertiti's. Some said Akhenaten had turned against him, fearing betrayal. Others believed the gods themselves had struck him down. Akhetaten, still a child, now carried the impossible weight of queenship. Her youth was spent not in joy, but in ritual. Every morning, she stood beside her father as he greeted the rising sun, her face lifted toward the blinding sky. She, too, would outlive him, only briefly. History would remember her as the last of the Amarna queens. Her name later changed Amun to fit a world restored to the old gods. Meanwhile, Akhenaten's empire was shrinking by the day. The borders once patrolled by Egypt's legions now stood undefended. In the north, the Hittites grew bold. In the south, Nubian tribes reclaimed their lands. The vassal states of the Near East, left to their fate, turned against Egypt or fell to conquest. The empire of the sun was fading into twilight. Inside Akhetaten, even the courtiers began to doubt. The city that had once glittered with gold was now marked by neglect. Paint peeled from temple walls. The great avenues where the pharaoh's chariots once paraded were empty. The nobles who had sung praises to Aten in his glory began to whisper of rebellion. In private, they made offerings to the old gods, once more, insurance for the soul, in case the sun failed to rise. Still, Akhenaten preached light. He composed hymns, built shrines, and spoke of a world renewed through truth. But his truth had become an empire of silence. He had surrounded himself with worshippers too afraid to question, and with daughters too loyal to refuse. Every act of devotion drew him further from the world of men and deeper into the isolation of his own divinity. Some accounts suggest that in his final years, the pharaoh withdrew almost entirely from public life. He lived in the royal palace by the river, his body frail, his mind consumed by visions. The desert outside shimmered under the heat. The city that had once sung his name waited for a dawn that no longer came. And then, one morning, the sun rose, and Akhenaten did not. There was no funeral recorded, no grand procession, no tomb uncovered that bears his name intact. Perhaps he was buried quickly in the cliffs above Akhetaten. Perhaps his body was moved later to Thebes and hidden under another name. What is certain is that his death marked the end of an era unlike any other. The Pharaoh of light was gone, and with him, the last rays of his revolution. But as the sun set over the empty city, the people of Egypt began to prepare for something new, a restoration, a reckoning, a return to the gods he had tried to erase. The chisels that had once built Akhetaten would soon be turned against it. The death of Akhenaten in 1336 BC was quiet, too quiet for a man who had once ruled the world through the power of the sun. No inscriptions record his burial, no triumphal hymns mourn his passing. The same city that had risen from the desert at his command now fell into stillness. The light that had once illuminated every corner of Akhetaten dimmed, and shadows reclaimed the walls. The horizon of Aten had set. What followed was less a succession than an unraveling. A mysterious figure, Aten, emerged in the records, a pharaoh whose identity remains debated even today. Some believe it was Nefertiti, reborn under a new name, ruling briefly to preserve her husband's vision. Others suggest it was one of Akhenaten's daughters, perhaps Meritaten herself, carrying the impossible weight of divine inheritance. For a moment, the flame flickered, but it could not survive the storm. The world beyond the Sun City was no longer patient. The priests of Amun, once silent, began to stir in Thebes. The generals, long ignored, gathered their armies again. The people, who who had endured years of famine and alien prayers, longed for the comfort of familiar gods. And from within the tangled branches of Akhenaten's own bloodline, a child emerged, the boy who would restore Egypt's heart and become its most famous king. His name was Tutankhaten, the living image of Aten. Born of incestuous lineage, likely the son of Akhenaten and one of his sister wives, the boy carried both the divine purity and the genetic curse of the heretic's blood. When he took the throne at perhaps 9 years old, he was surrounded not by prophets, but by survivors, men who had endured Akhenaten's revolution and were determined to rebuild the old order. At their head was the elderly vizier I, possibly Nefertiti's father, who had served through the turbulent years of the Amarna court. Beside him stood General Horemheb, commander of what remained of Egypt's armies. These were practical men. They had seen the sun's kingdom collapse. They knew Egypt could not live on light alone. Within 3 years, the restoration began. The boy king's name was changed from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun. The sun god of Akhetaten was replaced by the hidden god of Thebes. The temples of Aten were shuttered, their offerings halted, their priests dismissed. The royal court abandoned the glittering city and returned to Memphis, leaving behind a ghost town that would soon be claimed by sand and silence. At Karnak, a new decree was carved into stone, a proclamation of renewal and rebuke. It spoke not of rebellion, but of healing. The temples of the gods and goddesses had gone to ruin. Their sanctuaries were overgrown with weeds. The land was in confusion, and the gods turned their backs upon it. Now the heart of the god rejoices once more, for the rightful worship has been restored. To the priests and the people, it was a cleansing, a return to order. To history, it was erasure. Every trace of Akhenaten's revolution was systematically destroyed. The great temples of Aten were torn apart, their stones repurposed for other monuments. The city of Akhetaten, once the radiant capital of the world, was dismantled block by block. Statues of the heretic Pharaoh were smashed, his likeness defaced beyond recognition. On the king lists, his name was omitted entirely. Egypt rewrote its own memory, leaping from the reign of Amenhotep III directly to Horemheb, as though the sun had never burned so brightly. In ancient Egypt, to be forgotten was the ultimate punishment. The soul's immortality depended on remembrance, on names spoken, images preserved, offerings made. By erasing Akhenaten, the restorers condemned him to a second death, the annihilation of identity. His tomb, if it was ever completed, was sealed and lost to time. His daughters, his queens, his vessels of divine continuity faded from the record, their names surviving only in fragments and broken reliefs. Even his god was forgotten. Aten, once hailed as the creator of all life, was reduced to dust beneath the returning feet of Amun's priests. For 3,000 years, the desert kept its secret. The sands swallowed Akhetaten completely. Only in the late 19th century did archaeologists, guided by scattered inscriptions and half-erased cartouches, rediscover the ruins. Beneath the sun-baked cliffs, they unearthed the remains of a city frozen in time, painted walls still vivid with colour, statues left mid-chisel, and shards of pottery, inscribed with hymns to a god no one had worshipped in millennia. In these ruins, the story of Akhenaten emerged again, fragmented, haunting, human. Modern scholars pieced together his revolution from broken stelae and half-remembered prayers. They uncovered the Amarna letters, revealing a ruler more mystic than monarch, who corresponded not with strategy, but with visions. And in the DNA of the mummies, they found the physical proof of his divine experiment. Tutankhamun, his son or perhaps grandson bearing the genetic scars of incest, his bones frail, his life cut short. Akhenaten had sought to purify the blood of gods. Instead, he weakened the flesh of men. Yet despite the ruin, his light endures. In the broken hymns carved into tomb walls, we hear the echo of his belief that the universe is bound by a single truth, a single source, a single light. His words, inscribed more than 3,000 years ago, still reach across time. You are in my heart. There is no other who knows you. Save your son, Akhenaten. You have made the earth as you desired, for men, for cattle, and for all that lives upon it. Even now, standing among the ruins of Amarna, one can almost hear the rhythm of those ancient chisels, the same that once built his city and later destroyed it. The wind sighs through the empty streets, carrying whispers of devotion and defiance. The sun sets behind the cliffs, its final light washing over the ghost of a dream, a city that once believed it could capture eternity in stone. Akhenaten's name may have been erased, but his audacity remains immortal. He was the pharaoh who defied heaven, the dreamer who married his daughters, the king who reached for the sun and was burned by it. His revolution was buried, his god forgotten, his city lost, but for one brief, blinding moment, he had changed the world. And as the desert night falls over the silent ruins, the last rays of the setting sun linger on the stone. For even the gods, it seems, remember the man who once tried to touch them.